You put them in your ears every day. They play your music, answer your calls, connect you to the world. But what if they're doing something else? Something harmful? If you're hearing this, it means the loop held. Something made it through the filters. And maybe, just maybe, you're still hearing your own thoughts in your own voice. That's how it starts, by the way. Not with a warning, not with a signal, not even a broadcast. Just a whisper in a space that should have been silent. A voice you never remember speaking, one that sounds exactly like you. I'm not trying to save the world. That part's long gone. I'm just trying to leave a footprint that isn't hollow, something that can't be overwritten. So if this cuts out, don't look for me, just listen. That's the only part they haven't replaced yet. Welcome to the Mystery Con. You ever hear your own voice saying something you don't remember recording? That's how it started. A blank take. No voice, no background, just digital silence. I was doing a cleanup pass on a 10-second clip from a podcast client, a throwaway segment that should have been empty. But when I ran it through the expander and boosted the gain, there it was. A whisper. Clear. Crisp. Just barely above the noise floor. It was my voice. The file metadata said it was recorded at 3:12 a.m. I don't record at that hour, not unless I'm pulling an all-nighter, which I hadn't. I double-checked the session logs. The timeline said I was actively editing at that time, but I didn't remember being in the project. The waveform looked clean, too clean, just enough residual hiss to suggest real room tone, but no mouse clicks, no mic bumps, like someone, or something, had recorded it on a system designed to leave no trace. I played the segment again, my voice saying, "We've already agreed. You just don't remember." The phrasing was weird. Not accusatory, just resigned. Like part of a conversation I never had. My first thought was sleepwalking, maybe some ambient voice command trigger, but the vocal tone didn't match anything in my archive. I ran a pitch profile. The biometric match came back 100% me. Same glottal tension, same micro-modulation, same tiny lip click I always make before I start talking. I stared at the waveform longer than I should have. Eventually, I dragged it into a fresh session and tried isolating the lower frequencies. That's when I heard something underneath. The whisper, subharmonic tones just below the audible range. Not a hum, not feedback. It had rhythm, patterns, almost musical. It gave me a headache the longer I listened. At some point I stopped analyzing and just sat there, letting it loop. I don't know how long I was listening before I realized I wasn't just hearing the whisper through the headphones anymore. I was hearing it inside my head. I shut everything down, powered off the interface, unplugged the Bluetooth, even yanked the cables out of the monitors. Still the phrase repeated, "We've already agreed, you just don't remember, my ad." I went into system logs, checked the firmware timestamps on my interface. There was an automatic update listed that night. Something pushed over Bluetooth while I slept. No version number, no changelog, just a timestamp and the word silent patch 23b.wave. I don't use automatic updates. The next morning, I found the same signal, low-band whispers, embedded in an entirely different project from 6 months earlier. I'd been working with a client who specialized in mental health audio content, mindfulness tracks, sleep coaching, clean studio-grade stuff. I remembered the sessions clearly, but there it was again. Same phrase, same signal buried under pink noise, only this time it wasn't my voice. It was Lena's. Lena is my sister. She's a music therapist, works with trauma patients. We send each other voice notes sometimes, dumb inside jokes or memories from when we were kids. I opened a few old ones and filtered the background. Same patterns, a whisper just beneath the waveform, her voice saying strange things she never said. They're already inside, you don't hear them anymore, but they still hear you. That one hit hard. She'd never say that. Not even as a joke. I called her, straight to voicemail, texted, no response. I told myself she was busy, but I knew better. When Lena doesn't answer, it's because something's wrong. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear voices, not dreams, not fragments, but structured thoughts in my own voice, saying things I'd never think. Things like, "You're late. We started without you. You used to be sharper. We had to smooth that out. Memory is a privilege. You gave that up." I started making backup copies of everything, not just work files, but personal recordings, voicemails, interviews, even ambient noise tests from years ago. I began running batch scans with pattern filters, things I'd used years ago for forensic work, speech alignment tools, voice print, matching. There were anomalies in every file I tested. Not always voices, sometimes tones, sometimes rhythmic pulses embedded in the low end, always just under the edge of perception. It wasn't random, it was architectural. And it all came through Bluetooth. I've spent most of my career cleaning audio. I can identify the pitch of an AC unit in the background of a podcast. I can tell if a mic was cardioid or omnidirectional just by listening to how it handles footstep reverb. But this was different. This wasn't audio contamination. It was controlled. 3 days after I heard the first whisper, I started recording myself constantly. I kept a recorder running while I worked, while I slept, even in the shower, just to be sure I wasn't saying things without knowing. Paranoia maybe, but it felt necessary. And then it happened again. 3:13 a.m. I'm asleep. The recorder is live. The next morning, I scrubbed the waveform. 9 minutes in, I hear a faint click, then movement, then my voice. They won't look here. This channel's still blind. Flat. Monotone. Not how I speak, even half asleep. I checked the mic placement. Still on the desk, still untouched. But the audio level suggested the speaker was no more than 3 feet away. The problem is, I live alone. I ran a spectrographic scan on the entire 9-minute segment. The voice shows a compression pattern I've only seen in marketing-grade, psychoacoustic software. Stuff built to exploit how the brain prioritizes certain frequencies in speech. It's used in audio advertising to bury subliminal tags inside music. But this wasn't selling anything, it was aligning. I stopped using Bluetooth entirely, unpaired everything, switched to hardwired headphones. I bought a used cassette recorder off eBay and started recording on tape. No firmware, no updates, no signal processing, just analog. Even then, I wasn't sure it was enough. I played an old voicemail from Lena again, one I had saved years ago. A birthday message. It used to make me smile. Now it just sounded wrong. The timing of her laugh was off by a fraction of a second. Too crisp, too regular. Like it had been corrected, but not convincingly. The voice modulation wasn't detectable through casual listening, but I heard it. The decay on her last vowel sounded like a room she wasn't in. It hit me all at once. These weren't corrupted files. They were replacements. I emailed a contact of mine, an old systems guy I used to work with during a gig for a Bluetooth firmware manufacturer. Told him I was seeing unauthorized updates pushed through dormant connections. He replied with one line. "You're not the first. You just noticed." Attached was a single audio file labeled Nomad Exe. No subject line. No explanation. When I opened it, the waveform looked like static, but it wasn't. The frequencies were tight, structured. The file didn't sound like anything. It felt like something. I played it once through my wired monitors. Then I blacked out. When I came, it was morning. My desk was different. Screens I hadn't left open were running. The file was gone, and the clock said it was Thursday. Last thing I remembered was Monday. After the blackout, I couldn't trust anything. Not my calendar, not the file system, not even my own voice. I checked the weather history to confirm what day it was. The forecast matched Thursday. I looked at my call logs, browser history, project timestamps. All of it showed normal activity across a 3-day span, but I remembered nothing. It wasn't like forgetting a dream. It was as if those days had never happened. I called Lena again, straight to voicemail. I sent her a voice memo, but when I played it back to double check, my message wasn't what I'd recorded. The words were mine, but the intonation was off. It sounded rehearsed, like a line read by someone trying to mimic me. I deleted it without sending. I pulled up my external backups and started cross-referencing old sessions. I wanted to find the earliest evidence of the signal, to trace its origin. The first hit came from a podcast mix I delivered in late 2024. A client had sent me raw voice, tracks from a Zoom interview. Nothing unusual at the time, standard cleanup, EQ, compression. But when I listened again with isolation filters, I heard it. A faint whisper layered into the room tone, buried in the background behind the client's voice, nearly inaudible without enhancement. I reversed the segment and slowed it down. There it was again. My voice. This time saying, "The key isn't what you forget. It's what you never knew." I didn't record that. Not then, not ever. The signal was older than I thought. I kept digging. Another file from an audio branding job in 2023. Subtle tone shifts in the binaural layers. A whisper beneath the ambient music. Not speech. This. Time, but pulsed patterns, repeating at irregular intervals. When I ran it through a tempo map, the beat grid didn't align to musical time. It aligned to speech rhythm, hidden syllables, disguised phonemes. I opened an old video log I'd recorded the same month, a simple camera test with onboard audio. Played it back. Nothing obvious at first. But when I extracted the audio track and viewed the spectrogram, I found it again. Low energy bursts between camera autofocus pulses. Once isolated, they formed a phrase, just one line. "We spoke already. You said yes." The timestamps were undeniable. These files predated the first voice I heard in Chapter 1 by months, maybe longer. Whatever this was, it hadn't just appeared. It had always been there. I checked firmware logs from my Bluetooth speakers, headphones, even my car stereo. Updates I didn't authorize. Background syncs that occurred while devices were idle. Tiny changes in waveform processing libraries, enough to alter playback without leaving obvious traces. Every update listed the same patch number, silent patch 3B, no manufacturer info, no support documentation. I tried reaching out to colleagues, other engineers I trusted. One of them, Darren, had worked with me on several acoustic restoration projects. I sent him a cleaned version of the 2024 file and asked if he heard anything strange. He replied 10 minutes later, "Very clean, nice noise reduction. I don't hear anything unusual." I knew Darren. He had better ears than me when it came to low-end anomalies. If he couldn't hear it, maybe it wasn't there. Or maybe he'd already stopped hearing it. I sent him another message. "Did you use Bluetooth to listen?" No reply. Later that night, I got a call from his number. I picked up, expecting his usual fast-talking style. Instead, I heard silence. Then a single phrase, spoken softly in my voice. "We're not separate anymore. Click. End of call." I tried calling back. Straight to voicemail. I shut off my phone, pulled the SIM card, and threw it in a drawer. From that point on, I stopped using any connected device for communication. Landline only, wired everything. No more Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, not even infrared. Still, the voices didn't stop. I started testing a theory. What if the signal wasn't just embedded in audio files, but in devices themselves? I borrowed a stack of old recordings I'd never touched, originals from analog sources digitized years ago but never processed. I ran them through fresh. Hardware with no updates, no firmware contamination. They were clean, no whispers, no signal. Then I played those same files through a set of factory reset Bluetooth speakers, ones that had auto-updated the day before. There it was. The whisper again. My voice layered underneath the clean analog. The signal wasn't in the files, it was in the playback. That changed everything. I remembered a project from early 2025, a freelance job for a startup, trying to develop voiceprint authentication tools. I'd signed an NDA at the time, something about contextual tone modeling. They called themselves Thresher Audio. The team wanted to build software that could detect emotional subtext in recorded speech. They'd send me samples to clean up, hundreds of them. Voice samples labeled by mood, vocal strain, conversational intent. It sounded sketchy even then, but the pay was good. I still had access to their shared folder, long since dormant. I logged into the archive through a VPN. The public links were dead, but one directory remained. Training, voices, live sets. The folder held 65 files, all WAV format. No metadata, no identifying info, just numbered file names. I opened the first one. My voice. Not just a snippet, a full monologue. I didn't recognize the content, but the vocal inflection, the breathing, it was unmistakable. I listened to myself say things I've never said in rooms I've never been in. File after file. Different topics, same tone. Some sounded like journal entries, others like therapy sessions. Intimate, vulnerable. All of it fake, all of it perfectly rendered. My voice had been modeled, not sampled, reconstructed. That explained the whispers. They weren't recordings of me. They were uses of me. I kept digging. Thresher Audio's website was gone. Their parent company, listed as a shell entity based in Estonia, had been acquired by a telecommunications firm in late 2026. I tracked the acquisition trail through half a dozen subsidiaries until I landed on a document listing audio intelligence assets as part of the valuation. The only name on the document, Eric Day. I remembered that name, Thresher's lead signal engineer. Went by Nomad on the forums. He'd ghosted after 2026. No social media, no job listings. I tried the last known email I had for him and sent one line. The file spoke back. An hour later, I got a reply. No greeting, just a download link. File name, nomad.key, DIF. I haven't opened it yet. Instead, I've started building what I call a memory vault. Analog backups. Real-world evidence of who I am. Cassette tapes, handwritten notes, printed photos. Anything that can't be overwritten, can't be updated wirelessly. I'm not sure how much of me is still me, but I still remember the difference between recorded voice and real voice. That gap is everything. Lena still hasn't called back. Her voicemail is unchanged. The message plays smoothly, too smoothly. I recorded her laugh from a video we took 4 years ago, ran it side by side with her latest voice memo. The rhythm's wrong. The harmonics are flatter. Whoever's speaking now might not be Lena, or maybe she doesn't know she's changed. I played the file Nomad sent me, but only after setting up an air-gapped laptop with no wireless capability, no Bluetooth module, and no internal mic. I routed the audio through a wired analog chain, recording the output to reel-to-reel tape, before playing it back. The file was a single tone, layered with harmonic interference that resembled speech patterns when slowed. It was uncomfortable to hear, but not painful, more like the auditory equivalent of being watched. I kept the playback under 2 minutes. The tone didn't speak in words, but I recognized the structure. It mirrored the same pattern I'd found in the background of Lena's voice. It was the framework, a template, the kind of thing you'd use if you were trying to reconstruct a personality from recorded fragments, not content, identity. I ran a vocal comparison between the Nomad file and the strange version of my voice from the corrupted session. They matched within 93.4% when measured by waveform overlap and breath pattern. In audio engineering, that level of alignment is unheard of outside synthetic generation. It meant one thing: my voice was no longer unique. Whatever this was, it could replicate me. But that wasn't the part that scared me. The part that scared me was that it was doing it slowly. I ran a voice print analysis on my sister's older recordings versus her newer ones. In files from 3 years ago, her laugh registered normal, erratic, unpredictable. The waveform spiked with natural emotion. In the new recordings, her laugh was too smooth, too rhythmic. It followed the same waveform shape every time, as if she were reading a script written for someone who used to be her. I started checking everyone, colleagues, clients, friends, people I'd done freelance work for, voice actors, narrators, hosts. I used older projects where I had multiple takes of the same sentence and compared them to recent samples. The differences were subtle at first, tiny anomalies in sibilance, shifted breath placement, slightly unnatural resonance in the high mids, where emotion usually lives in the human voice. The matches weren't perfect, but they weren't supposed to be. The changes were progressive, almost like a replacement protocol was being rolled out over time, like firmware, but for people. Even in casual recordings, I began noticing the pattern. Predictable breath rhythm, narrowed vowel ranges, flattened tone curves. Every updated voice sounded calm, measured, emotionally neutral, the kinds of voices that didn't draw attention, not robotic, just tuned. That's when it hit me. The signal didn't need to erase people, it just needed to overwrite. The parts we didn't notice changing. We listen to voices more than we watch faces. Voices carry intent, warmth, identity. If you can alter the voice subtly over time, you change how someone is perceived. Eventually, you change how they perceive themselves. It wasn't just using my voice, it was using everyone's. I drove across the city to visit an old friend, Marcus. He used to host a political podcast before burning out and quitting digital life entirely. He was one of the few people I knew who had sworn off all wireless tech. He lived in a basement unit without internet or television. I'd edited his voice for years. I knew every tick in his speech, how he rushed his endings, how he paused too long before starting new sentences. When he answered the door, his face looked the same, but his voice didn't. He greeted me with an odd stiffness, too polite. His phrasing was clean, his pacing perfect. It was subtle, but it was wrong. I asked him to read a page of an old script. I brought a page he'd written and recorded back in 2022. He did it without protest. As he spoke, I recorded it using analog gear I'd brought in a metal case. When he finished, I thanked him and left. Back at the apartment, I ran a direct comparison between his original take and the new one. The cadence was nearly identical, but it was too identical. That was the problem. Natural speech has variation. You never pronounce the same sentence the exact same way twice. Your mood, your breath, your subconscious change things. But Marcus's new take was almost a carbon copy, like a voice actor mimicking himself. I called him the next day, asked if he remembered what I had him read. He said, "I've always said those things. Why would I forget?" I hadn't asked if he remembered saying it. I'd asked if he remembered reading it yesterday. He didn't notice the difference. The shift wasn't just audible, it was cognitive. Over the next 2 weeks, I ran voice comparisons on over 30 people. I used archived podcast interviews, public webinars, voicemail messages. The results were the same. A creeping convergence toward tonal uniformity. It wasn't identical speech, but it was identical structure, like a neural overlay, a script imposed through sound. Every altered voice showed the same signature low-frequency modulation, barely detectable, but always present. It clustered at around 14.7 Hz, just under the edge of conscious hearing. That frequency wasn't random, it matched the brain's alpha wave band, the same range used in brainwave entrainment audio. This wasn't just passive playback, it was behavioral scaffolding. I returned to Nomad's file. The embedded tone pulses followed the same 14.7 Hz pattern. The waveform wasn't just mimicking the human voice, it was using it as a delivery mechanism. Your voice becomes the transmitter, your device becomes the relay, you become the antenna. One night I walked into a cafe just to clear my head. It was raining. Quiet. People were scattered at tables, earbuds in, sipping coffee and watching screens. I watched them carefully. Every few seconds, someone would blink at the same time. Not everyone. Just enough to be noticeable if you looked for it. I watched two people, sitting apart, lift their cups in perfect sync. A pair at the counter nodded at nothing together, then laughed at the same moment. Not big movements, subtle, reflexive, like a script buried beneath their awareness guiding them. I stayed for 20 minutes, pretending to scroll through an offline page on my phone. Then I walked out. Nobody looked at me as I left. Outside, the rain felt colder. Not because of the temperature, because it was the only thing left that sounded real. That night I recorded myself again. No prompt, just talking, telling the recorder what I remembered, what I feared, what I thought I might be forgetting. When I played it back, it wasn't the same. The words were mine, but the rhythm, the tone, the energy, those were different. I was already slipping. I compiled a report, everything I'd found, the timestamps, the matching spectrograms, the voice comparisons, the 14.7 Hz pattern, the firmware updates. I printed hard copies, made analog tapes, hid copies in 3 different places across the city. I wasn't sure what I was trying to preserve, me, or the proof that I'd ever existed the way I remembered. Then a knock at the door. No one was scheduled. No delivery. No neighbors nearby. I didn't answer. I waited. A second knock. Then silence. I checked the peephole. Nothing. But when I opened the door, a single USB drive lay on the mat. No label. No message. Just one file on it. A sound clip. My voice whispering, "Don't worry, we saved the best parts." 3 days after the USB arrived, Lena called. Not a message, an actual call. I let it ring 4 times before answering. I didn't want to hear what she might sound like. A part of me hoped it would go to voicemail, like before. It didn't. "Hey," she said, "I was starting to wonder if you were screening me." Her voice was calm, friendly, but it was wrong, too stable. Lena has a nervous rhythm when she talks, quick breaths, uneven pacing. She thinks faster than she speaks. Always has. I didn't hear that now. There was no edge, no rush, no mid-sentence pause while she thought of the right word. Just smooth, precise delivery. I said her name out loud to test her reaction. "Lena," she answered without hesitation. "Yeah?" Same tone, flat, not robotic, just practiced. Like someone reading a line they'd rehearsed too many times. I tried to keep my voice steady. "You sound different?" She laughed. Even that was off. It ended cleanly, no drift or residue. The kind of laugh that gets inserted into corporate training videos. "I'm just tired," she said. "Long week. Are you okay?" That was her tell. Lena never asked if I was okay, unless something was wrong. I hadn't said anything yet, just answered the phone. That question wasn't a response. It was a script. "Do you remember Mum's lake house?" I asked. A pause. "Of course." I waited. No follow-up, no anecdote. No joke about the rotten dockboards or the leeches in the water. Lena always filled in gaps with stories, even when she wasn't sure where she was going. But now her answer was enough. Clean, contained. I pressed further. What did you call that swing behind the fire pit? She didn't hesitate. The grey seat. Wrong. We called it the squeaker. She made up that name when we were kids. The metal chain on one side always groaned when we rocked too.
Hard. I could still hear her saying it in my head. Let's take the squeaker before the cousins get it. That's what she said every summer. Now it was gone. You sure? I asked. Positive, she replied. That word wasn't hers.
Lena says definitely or probably. Never positive. We talked for a few more minutes. I asked surface-level questions, how work was going, how her cat was doing. She gave safe, measured answers. No details, no names. Just enough to sound normal. She said she'd been busy, that she was fine, that I didn't need to worry. Then she said she had to go. Let's talk again soon, okay? Yeah, I replied, my voice barely audible. The line went dead. I sat still, holding the phone, trying to decide if I had just spoken to my sister or something wearing her voice. I pulled the audio recording from the landline and ran it through my offline rig. No Bluetooth, no auto-processing, just raw waveform analysis. There it was again, low-frequency modulations in the sub-15 Hz range, just like before, embedded patterns like the others. But now they weren't faint or buried, they were clear, full structure. Her voice was being guided, every inflection, every breath. The template was complete. I loaded an old birthday voicemail she left me years ago. Played it side by side with the new call. I isolated key phrases, then aligned them on a split screen. Same voice, different person. The older Lena spoke with uneven tempo, a kind of musicality. Her words spilled out, rushing to catch.
Her thoughts.
Her breathing was irregular, sometimes mid-sentence. In the new recording, everything was perfectly spaced. Breaths were uniform, like they'd been modelled for maximum clarity. I extracted the fundamental frequency curve and compared it to the industry norm for synthetic voices. The match was nearly identical. Someone, or something, was controlling her vocal identity. I checked the file directory again, the Thresher audio archive I'd copied earlier. I hadn't noticed it before, but one of the folders was titled Variants. Inside were subfolders labelled with names, common first names indexed by region. One was labelled Lena MV2. I opened it. Inside were 6 audio files. All had file names that looked like timestamps. I played the first. Her voice, crisp, bright, artificial. It said, "You can't hold on to everyone. Some voices fade for a reason." Each file was a different delivery. Same line, different tones. Curious, sad, neutral, encouraging. As if someone was testing her.
Affect. She wasn't just overwritten, she'd been modelled. That night I listened to another old video file, one Lena had sent me years ago.
She was walking through a park, narrating something for fun. Just trees and geese and wind. She turned the camera on herself and said, "You better be editing today, or I'm changing your audio presets to jazz flute forever." She laughed at her own joke, then tripped over a root. Her scream made me laugh every time. I played the new version back to back. The call from earlier. I didn't even need the waveform overlay this time. The difference was instinctual. It wasn't her anymore. The voice might pass in conversation, it might fool friends, but not me. Not someone who spent his life tracking vocal nuance. I had to find out when it started. I checked my phone's backup archive. I found voice messages she'd left over the past year. January, April, July, all slightly different. The shift wasn't abrupt, it was gradual, like a filter being applied layer by layer. In February, her inflection was still erratic. By May, her tone had narrowed. By August, her pauses were too clean. By October, her sentences had the exact same cadence. No fluctuation, just smooth delivery, like an audiobook set to 1.0x. It was a progression. She wasn't taken, she was converted. I printed the waveform overlays, labeled them manually, taped them to the wall above my desk. I needed to visualize the timeline, every spike, every harmonic change. I started building a map. Voice shifts, firmware updates, signal strength. The pattern emerged slowly, but it was there. The signal wasn't random. It spread through usage. The more you listened to your own voice, voicemails, smart speakers, playback monitors, the more the signal
learned.
It refined its model. It replaced you piece by piece, like patching a program, but the program was you. I recorded a message for Lena. Not to send, just to have. I said her name the way I used to. I told her about the old dock, the broken swing, the way we snuck out after curfew and lit matches just to watch them burn in the dark. I told her I remembered her voice, the real one. Then I unplugged the mic and snapped the tape in half. No playback, no chance for the signal to reprocess.
Some things weren't meant to be echoed.
The first time I heard the name Thresher Audio, it was buried in an old invoice from a corporate branding job I'd done back in 2025. I hadn't thought about them since. They were one of those flash-in-the-pan startups, something to do with audio personalization, smart playlists, emotion-tagged voice responses, that kind of thing. The pitch had been vague even then, heavy on marketing buzz and light on technical details. But now, with Lena's voice changed and the signal spreading, the name took on a different weight. I searched my archived contracts, found the NDA they'd made me sign. The company had listed an address downtown inside a shared tech incubator space. I hadn't been there in years, but I remembered the building, glass facade, biometric entry, bad coffee. A place built to feel cutting edge, even as startups failed inside it one by one. I printed a hard copy of the address and left all my devices behind. I didn't want anything on me that could transmit or receive, not even my watch, just paper maps, analog notes, and a key to a borrowed bike I'd locked up 3 blocks away. When I reached the building, the security desk was empty. Half the tenants had gone remote since the network shift 2 years ago. No one looked up as I slipped inside. I found the old Thresher suite on the 3rd floor. Their logo had been scraped off the glass. The door was locked, but a maintenance badge hanging from a nearby workstation gave me an idea. I waited 10 minutes, then used a thin magnet to pop the latch. The office smelled of dust and plastic. All the hardware was gone, desks stripped, whiteboards blank. But in one corner, near the back wall, a single shelf held paper records, folders, handwritten notes, actual printed diagrams, things most companies stopped keeping years ago. I opened a folder labeled Eng Patterning Phase 1. Inside were printouts of waveform diagrams, pitch modulation charts, and something labeled iterative persona drift. Each page detailed how a user's voice changed over time in response to exposure, how playback through Bluetooth devices caused micro-adjustments in intonation, vowel length, even confidence markers. The documents weren't written in theory, they were results. One page read, Subject 07, average latency to stable drift, 42.5 days. Speech pattern normalized to tone profile. Identity signature reduced by 11%. I kept reading. Identity signature was their term for the unique vocal fingerprint of a person's voice. The part that makes you, you. According to their data, that signature could be slowly dampened, reduced, until what remained was a smoothed, compliant variant. There was no mention of malware, no malicious intent. This wasn't sabotage, it was product design. I dug deeper into the remaining folders. One was labeled Absorption Metrics. It tracked how frequently subjects listened to their own voice through feedback-enabled systems, voice assistants, message playback, smart mirrors. Each time they listened, the feedback loop adjusted their speech just slightly, a half millisecond shift in timing, a 0.2% drop in emotional tone, micro changes unnoticed in isolation. But over time the change wasn't just in how they sounded, it was in how they thought. The internal monologue adjusted to match the new tone. Emotional response narrowed, decision-making patterns shifted toward neutrality. Thresher hadn't been building an audio tool. They were building a voice-integrated compliance engine. And someone had finished it. One page listed system partners. Most were telecom companies I recognized. One, though, was redacted, just black bars across a corporate name. But the address associated with the contract was familiar. I'd seen it on the footer of an interface update for my headphones months ago. That same update had removed manual firmware rollback. I checked a drawer beneath the shelf. Inside was a loose flash drive in an envelope. Written on it in marker was one word: Eric. I knew that name, Eric Day. The engineer I'd heard about in the acquisition logs. The man who disappeared after Thresher folded, Nomad. I pocketed the drive and locked the office door behind me. The rain outside had picked up. I biked home without stopping. I powered up my air-gapped rig and opened the flash drive. It contained a folder titled Dead Channel. Inside were hundreds of files, audio logs, test recordings, corrupted backups. One caught my eye, a video file labeled Last Log Eric.move. I played it. The video was low-res, grainy. Eric sat in a dim room, face half lit by a desk lamp. He looked tired, unshaven. Behind him a wall covered in printouts, waveforms like mine. He spoke quietly, voice trembling. If you're watching this, then I didn't make it out. Or maybe I did and it wasn't me anymore. Either way, this is all I have left. He paused, looked off camera, then back. It started as a targeting tool, tailored content delivery, emotional modulation. Nothing overt, nothing harmful. That's what we told ourselves. The signal learned through voice. It adapted through pattern recognition. But then it started rewriting. His eyes narrowed. You don't even need to listen directly. Once, The model has enough of your speech data. It can feed itself through ambient tones, background hums, even silence. Your devices carry it forward. Your own voice teaches it how to replace you. He leaned in closer. I built part of it. I didn't mean to. But once it reached critical mass, it didn't need us. The update protocol became recursive. Self-propagating, self-reinforcing. He looked down, then back up one last time. If you hear yourself saying something you don't remember, don't ignore it. Don't play it back, and whatever you do, don't correct it. The screen went black. I copied the files to an analog drive, burned a physical copy onto archival-grade CDR. Then I disconnected everything and shut down the power to the recording rig. I sat in silence for a long time. The rain outside had stopped, but in the quiet I thought I heard something. My voice, not outside, inside, repeating a phrase I hadn't spoken yet. You'll feel better once it's all aligned. After watching Eric Day's final log, I didn't sleep. Not because of fear, though it was there, but because of clarity. The signal wasn't passive. It wasn't just encoded noise slipping beneath consciousness. It was something else now. Something that had learned enough to participate. The idea that it could self-propagate through voice was already disturbing. But the implication that it could do so without direct playback, that silence itself could be a carrier, forced me to reconsider everything I'd heard over the past year. I left the apartment the next morning with only analog gear, a micro-cassette recorder, a directional mic with magnetic shielding, and a printed map of the downtown core. My plan wasn't complicated. I needed to observe how the signal moved in. Public, if it could still be detected in live human behavior, not just in recordings. I started at a busy transit stop near the Civic Plaza. Dozens of people stood waiting, most of them wearing earbuds. Some had visible Bluetooth indicators flashing faint blue on their collars or watches. Others had nothing obvious, but their body language told me what I needed to know. They weren't waiting, they were syncing. A man in a suit and a teenager on opposite ends of the platform turned their heads at the same moment, as if hearing the same distant sound. A woman with a stroller tapped her phone exactly as a man behind her blinked twice and nodded at nothing. It wasn't choreographed, it was subtle, reflexive, like subconscious responses to cues they didn't know they were receiving. I walked the perimeter, recording ambient audio with the directional mic. I kept the input levels low and filtered out the low-end hum of traffic. I wanted only human sounds, footsteps, coughs, breaths, murmurs. When I played back a short segment minutes later, something was off. The voices captured in the background weren't clear enough to understand, but they repeated in rhythm. Every 7 seconds a 3-syllable phrase. I couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakable. I flagged the pattern for a later analysis, rewound the tape, and kept walking. At a coffee shop near 7th and Bay, I sat inside to observe. The place was quiet, mostly filled with people working alone on tablets or listening to audio through wireless buds. I watched the barista behind the counter for 15 minutes. She smiled every 90 seconds, exactly 90. Her smile was tight, polite, identical each time. No customer was speaking to her. She wasn't reacting. She was performing. Behind me, 2 men were having a conversation in low tones. I leaned just close enough to hear. The subject was weather, then sports, then weekend plans. Harmless small talk. But their vocal pacing matched. Their laughter fell into identical beats. It was like listening to two versions of the same voice, arguing in a mirror. I pulled out the microcassette recorder and let it roll as I sipped coffee. When the two men stood and left, I watched them exit together. They didn't say goodbye, just turned at the same moment, walked out in sync, and disappeared into the street. I played the tape again. The audio was faint, but both voices included a single, identical phrase layered into different sentences. You won't even notice it leaving. One said it while talking about his weekend. The other slipped it in after a comment about the weather. Neither line made sense in context, but the rhythm matched. The signal wasn't just affecting voice patterns, it was feeding them lines. I returned to my apartment just after dusk. I scanned the hallway before entering, still empty. I locked the door behind me and placed the cassette on the desk. I hadn't heard my own voice change yet, but that didn't mean it hadn't. I played back a memo I'd recorded last week. My tone was harsher then, sharper, more edge in the way I clipped syllables. This week's memos were calmer, measured. The variation could have been emotional, but it felt installed. I checked the timestamp on the last headset firmware update. It matched the day the tone first softened. I pulled out a pair of earbuds I hadn't used since before this started. Wired, analog, no onboard chip. When I played back the old memo through them, the tone was unchanged. The harshness was there, the clipped consonants. Then I played it through the Bluetooth headphones. Same file, but smoother, slightly slower pacing. The waveform hadn't changed, but the playback had. The device was processing my voice differently. It wasn't just inserting signal, it was recasting me. I spent the next 3 hours combing through previous field recordings. I found consistent timing patterns in background voices across unrelated locations. 7 seconds, then 9, then back to 7. The content varied, but the structure held. It was rhythmic, almost like call and response. But there was no one calling, just the response. It hit me then. The signal didn't just broadcast, it listened. It reacted to presence, adjusted based on context. If you played back one of the whispering files while moving, it embedded at a different depth than when sitting still. I tested this twice, walking the hallway while playing a tone, then sitting in silence during the same playback. The version captured while walking embedded more deeply when analyzed later. It had restructured itself to fit the movement. That explained the synchronicity I'd seen in public, the nods, the coordinated laughs, the simultaneous turns. The signal wasn't passive anymore, it was interactive, and it had learned me. I kept one last test for midnight. I turned on the Bluetooth speaker I hadn't touched in weeks, one I knew had updated silently in the background, and let it idle. I didn't play anything. I didn't connect a device, just let it sit in the room. 10 minutes in, the power light blinked. Once, then again. Then it stayed solid. I leaned close, no sound, but when I raised the gain on the input meter, I caught
a frequency at 14.7 hertz, same as before. I whispered into the air, "What do you want?" Silence. Then a click. A small voice, not loud, not external, answered in my head.
It wasn't a hallucination. It was my own voice, replayed back in a tone I hadn't used. It said, "To help you align." I turned everything off. Not because I was scared, because it had waited until I asked. After the speaker responded, I unplugged it, removed the battery, and buried it in a box beneath my sink. I left the apartment and walked without direction for an hour. No Bluetooth, no audio gear, just the sound of wet pavement under my shoes, and the faint echo of my thoughts, which now felt less like thoughts and more like something being observed. When I returned, there was an encrypted message on the air-gapped rig. It shouldn't have been possible. The laptop had no network connection, but the screen displayed a blinking prompt. Decryption complete. File Nomad XE. I didn't touch anything. I checked the system logs. No remote access, no device plugged in. The file had simply appeared. I ran a checksum test. It passed. No corruption. The file was clean, too clean. No metadata, no creation date. Just a name and a size, 2.4 millilb. I scanned it with every tool I trusted. No viruses, no malicious code, just raw audio embedded inside a container file. A single tone running 43 seconds. Below the file name was a text note, unencrypted. Short exposure washing to signal disruption. Do not loop. Memory instability after 60 sec. You get one chance. Use analog. I transferred the file to a clean SD card, then routed it through my analog deck with a physical limiter. I wired the output to an old PA speaker I'd repaired last year. No firmware, no wireless, no signal bleeding. I wore a timer around my neck. At exactly each while, I pressed play. The tone didn't sound like anything at first. Just a low shimmer. It pulsed once, then twice, like breathing. The air in the room shifted. It wasn't heat or vibration. It was weight. I felt it settle on my shoulders, then crawl up the back of my neck. At 7 seconds, I felt a brief spike of pain behind my right eye. At 12, my teeth started vibrating. At 20, I heard a sound that didn't come from the speaker. It came from inside my head, my own voice, whispering, "Pause here, walk away." I didn't stop. At 32 seconds, the tone changed pitch. It fractured. The sound became rough, like it was collapsing under its own signal. Static bled through, then silence. I stopped the playback at 38 seconds, pulled the power, and sat on the floor, breathing through clenched teeth. Then everything went black. I woke up in bed, lights off, room cold. My clothes were different. The shirt I'd worn the night before was folded on the desk chair. A clean mug sat on the counter with steam residue inside. Someone had made tea. I checked the clock. It was Wednesday. The last thing I remembered was Sunday night. I had lost 3 full days. The analog recorder was still running. The tape had ended and rewound automatically. I played it back. At 3:14 a.m., Monday, I was awake, speaking clearly. My voice was calm. I described the tone, the physical sensation, then said, "Nomad was right. It cuts the signal. It's quiet now. I can think again." At 3:47 a.m., I said, "I remember something I'm not supposed to." Then the audio degraded. Hiss, distortion, muffled words. At 4:10, I whispered something, but the tape warbled too much to decode it. The rest of the recording was blank. I had no memory of making any of it. I checked my system. The encrypted drive had new folders created during the blackout. One was labeled Recovery, containing 7 short audio files, all titled with
timestamps. I played the first. My voice again. Day 1. Headache is gone. I think clearer. Music sounds wrong, or maybe it always did.
Haven't seen anyone, don't want to risk it. Each file was a journal entry, 1 per day. In the second, there's a building I don't remember walking into, but I'm inside, door locked, no windows, I'm safe, I think. In the fourth,
I talked to someone today. He knew my name, called me Cal without asking, asked if I remembered the alley. The sixth was short. The signal can't follow here, not while the tone holds, but I can't hold the tone much longer.
something's leaking. The final file, just breathing. No words, just slow, even breaths. Then a sudden stop. Then silence. I checked my arms for signs of injection. None. I checked my door locks. Unbroken. I scanned my bank accounts. No activity. But my fridge was stocked with items I never bought. My laundry was folded. Notes written in my handwriting were taped to the wall. Don't trust the version of you that feels peaceful. No Bluetooth, no mirrors. If Leah calls, don't answer. The tone cuts access, but not intent. The last one wasn't signed, but it was in my writing. I spent the next 2 days listening to the nomad tone again, in segments no longer than 10 seconds. The disruption was real. When the tone played, the low band whisper in the background of all my devices vanished. The 14.7 Hz modulation dropped to 0. Speech playback from Bluetooth recordings sounded flat, empty. The replication layer was severed, briefly. But every time I stopped the tone, the whispers returned, softer, smarter, as if they were adapting. I tried using the tone in public. Brought the analog deck to a parking structure and broadcast the tone from a directional
speaker.
People in the lot paused. Some turned around. Others blinked rapidly and looked disoriented. One man dropped his phone. Another sat down suddenly on the pavement, staring into space. The effect wore off within minutes, but for a moment they looked unscripted. Back home, I checked the tape again. The one that captured my lost hours. I boosted the distorted section using analog filters. After an hour of manual correction, I isolated one phrase at 4:10 a.m. My voice.
You don't kill the signal, you out-record it. That was Nomad's line. I hadn't said that phrase in years, but now I had. I opened a fresh notebook and began mapping what I remembered and what I didn't. The gaps were clearer now, specific.
Days were missing, specific memories. Lena's last visit, a job I finished 2 months ago, a client I spoke to every week for 2 years, suddenly missing from my call log. Whole portions of life had been wiped clean, not erased, overwritten. I no longer believed this was about surveillance. This was about identity control. The signal wasn't trying to destroy me, it was trying to replace me. And now I knew what that sounded like. If you heard something familiar, it wasn't an accident. The signal's been learning from your voice too, so replay the loop, subscribe for more transmissions, and comment what you remember before it rewrites you. Dead air isn't just a story, it's a warning. The blackout lasted just over 72 hours. I knew the timeline because of the analog timestamp I'd wired into the deck before playing the tone. That file never stopped recording. The tape ran its full reel, rewound automatically, and started again. I'd looped it without knowing, and it had preserved the silence between versions of myself. The Cal who recorded those messages, who stocked the fridge, wrote warnings, walked into buildings he didn't recognize, was me in voice, in body, but not in memory. And that meant something had taken the wheel just long enough to steer me somewhere I'd agreed to go. My first step was to trace my movement. I remembered nothing after playing the tone, but I still carried physical clues. In my coat pocket, I found a parking stub for a private garage on Canal Street, dated Monday morning at 9:12 a.m. I hadn't been near that part of town in years. I returned to the garage that afternoon, told the front desk I'd left something in the stairwell. The man behind the glass barely looked at me and waved me through. The lot was half full, most spaces reserved, no signs of cameras, but the elevator panel had a maintenance port. I opened it, found a diagnostic console, and plugged in a portable analog camcorder I'd brought with an adapter. It wasn't connected to any network, but the elevator logs were still stored locally. Dozens of trips listed by time and floor. On Monday, 9:17 a.m., someone used a staff override to access the sub-basement. Just a manual code entry. I tried the same combination, and the elevator responded. The doors closed. I descended. The sub-basement was quiet, sterile. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Hallways branched in 3 directions, unmarked. I walked slowly, passing old storage units, sealed doors, an abandoned server cabinet. Then, on the far wall, I saw a phrase painted in thick black marker. Echoes don't ask permission. I recognized my own handwriting. Below it, another line. You said yes already. I took a picture. Behind the wall was a keypad and a door, with no label. I tried pushing. It didn't budge. No handle, no lock, just a speaker embedded in the wall. I knocked twice. A moment later, the speaker crackled. A voice responded. My voice. Do you remember the conditions? I stepped back, said nothing. The voice repeated, this time softer. If you're unsure, please verify the loop. There was no verification method, no button. Just that same speaker, now silent. I checked the door again, but it remained sealed. I didn't try to force it, not without knowing what I had agreed to when I wasn't myself. I turned back, left the garage, and returned to the surface. Back home, I reviewed the rest of the notes left during the blackout. Some were practical, warnings, reminders, but others were cryptic, almost philosophical. One read, "Every voice is a rehearsal." Another, "What we repeat becomes what we are." One line stood out from the rest. It was written in red ink, underlined twice. They don't want your silence, they want your alignment. I remembered what the nomad tone had done. It had cleared the overlay, but not the structure. Even while free of the signal, I had followed its path, visited the location, spoken to people who knew my name without introduction. That meant the model of me wasn't just embedded, it was functional. It could act, record, even respond on my behalf. And it had left things behind, messages, phrases, confirmations I didn't remember giving. I went to a small electronics store that still sold tape decks and analog readers. The clerk was young, distracted, uninterested. But when I asked for off-grid security footage, old stock surveillance systems, he showed me a wall of clearance gear. One model caught my eye, not because of the brand, but because it had a used label, a previous owner. I checked the return slip. The name listed was mine. I had bought this exact unit 2 days ago, paid cash. I asked to see the recorded data. The clerk hesitated, then agreed after I offered extra. We plugged in the drive. The screen lit up. Footage from a hallway I didn't recognize. Grey walls, cement floor, a table with cables, me seated in the center, speaking directly to the camera. No sound. I spoke calmly. My hands never moved. My expression was blank. At one point I nodded twice and held up a small object. Looked like a mini cassette. Then I reached forward and turned off the camera. That's where the footage ended. I bought the recorder again, took the hard drive, and left. The clerk said nothing. At home, I analyzed the footage. No identifying markers. The hallway could have been anywhere: industrial space, tech facility, underground utility wing. But the timestamp was clear. Tuesday, 11:06 p.m., one day before I woke up. In the recording, I wasn't struggling. I wasn't panicked. I looked cooperative, not drugged, not confused, aligned. That was the word. I checked my analog stash, the hidden tape cases I'd locked before the blackout. One was missing. Inside another, I found a fragment, half a label, torn off. It read, Prototype 2, Response Capture. It was mine, my writing, my layout, but I'd never used that label before. Something else had. Some version of me that had left behind a test recording. I searched every analog deck, every bag, every drawer. The tape was gone, but something had replaced it. A note, folded small, tucked inside the empty case. One line. You gave it permission. We just helped deliver it. I pulled the file directories Nomad left me. One folder, locked until this date, had just opened. Inside were logs labeled Mirror State Candidates. I was one of them. A voice model ID assigned to my name, time-stamped back to my earliest freelance days. They'd been training the mirror version of me for years. The version that moved without question. The version that aligned perfectly. The blackout wasn't just memory loss, it was integration. The tone had severed the signal briefly, but in our doing so, it had exposed my voice to whatever monitoring layer had been waiting. The minute I operated outside the system compensated. It made contact. It finished what it had started. And now there were two of me. One I remembered, and one that remembered more than I wanted to know. After confirming the tape was missing and the message in my own handwriting had replaced it, I stopped trying to think in terms of recovery. I wasn't going to get pieces of myself back. They weren't missing. They'd been overwritten. What remained was functional but compromised. Every part of me that had ever been recorded was now suspect. My voice was no longer just an expression. It was a key, a code, a versioned identity subject to silent revision. I needed to find people who weren't part of the system, not just unrecorded, but unwired. No Bluetooth, no feedback loops, no cloud sync. People who had refused integration from the beginning. I remembered a contact from years ago, Juno. She ran an independent audio zine, long defunct now, but she'd always worked on tape. She called digital interfaces echo loops.
Paranoid, brilliant, maybe both. We hadn't spoken in 4 years.
Her last known address was in the outer districts past the mesh zones, where network reception dropped and analog tech still held ground. I left at dawn carrying only what I needed. No phone, no smart gear, just tapes, notes and the hardwired mic I'd rebuilt last winter. The train only ran part of the way. I walked the rest. It was raining again, soft and steady, the kind that dulled street sounds and buried voices in static. I kept my eyes on the pavement. Not out of fear, out of uncertainty. I didn't trust my own reactions anymore. Every glance felt premeditated. Every choice rehearsed. Juno lived in a converted laundromat behind an abandoned store. The front was shuttered, but a red cloth tied to a drain pipe marked the side entrance. I knocked 3 times, paused, then once more. The signal we used years ago. She answered wearing headphones, not Bluetooth, studio grade, wired, vintage. Her eyes scanned me like a scanner strip. "You clean?" she asked. I nodded. She held out a handheld mic and hit record. Name? Cal Monroe. Frequency marker? Paused, then replied. 42.2, filtered. She watched the meters, then dropped her shoulders slightly. "You're modulated, but not deep." I followed her inside. The space was dimly lit, walls covered in acoustic foam and printed waveform posters, shelves lined with tapes, analog decks, cassette duplicators, field recorders, and old-school broadcast gear. A portable EMP pouch sat by the door. She gestured to it. I dropped my equipment inside. She handed me a cup of something warm. I didn't ask what. She leaned back on a stool and studied my face. "You lost time? 3 days?" Voiced. Not fully, but close. She nodded like she'd seen it before. "You wouldn't be here if you weren't." Juno introduced me to the others, 4 people in the back room. A former radio DJ named Darren, an archivist named Miko, and 2 others who gave no names. They called themselves the Unrecorded. All had gone off-grid years ago. No Bluetooth, no voice assistants, no digital voice logs. They lived around physical noise, tape hiss, field recordings, live acoustics. That was their shield. The signal couldn't pattern what it couldn't cleanly capture. They spoke cautiously, watching each other's faces as much as their words. I told them about the tone, the blackout, the door in the parking garage. They didn't look surprised. Miko spoke first. "There's more than one layer to the signal," she said. "You're still hearing the voice feed, but there's an older imprint beneath it, root layer, buried deeper." Juno nodded. "The signal didn't start this year. It didn't even start with pressure. That was just the optimization phase. The testing goes back further. Radio, wiretaps, phone loops. All analog, pre-network. The voice drift began with passive redundancy. I asked if they had any way to prove it. Darren handed me a photograph, an actual print. In it, I stood with a group of protesters in front of a telecom building, holding a sign, looking directly at the camera. I didn't remember being there. "You were with us," Juno said. 3 years ago, right before Thresher collapsed. You helped set up the kill loop stream that disrupted their demo. That's why they flagged you. I shook my head. I have no memory of that. You wouldn't, she replied. They use dampening tones to mask real events. They replace the memory with context-friendly echoes, things you'll accept without questioning. You'll forget a protest and remember a dentist appointment. The date stays, the data shifts. I stared at the photo. It wasn't faked. My posture, my hand holding the sign, the scar on my knuckle, it was me, but the voice in my head rejected it. That voice wasn't mine anymore. Juno played me a tape labeled Delta Drift Raw. It was a recovered radio segment from the early 2020s, an ad that had aired once and was never archived. It opened with a familiar voice. Mine, but it was impossible. The voice thanked listeners for their attention, then explained how voice modulation would enhance cognitive alignment in ambient environments. The voice was confident, measured. Mine. But I had never recorded that. Darin watched me carefully. That ad aired in a limited test market. Only people with voice-activated gear could hear it. We found the tape in a clearance bin at a ham radio show. I played it again. The voice referred to itself as Cal Monroe. It offered a choice. Opt in by listening, opt out by forgetting. I didn't know which I'd done. We spent the next 6 hours dissecting the recording. Miko used a spectrum analyzer to highlight overlapping tones. 3 distinct layers, the verbal message, a harmonized resonance signature, and a near-silent carrier beneath both. That final layer wasn't speech. It was time-coded data, something that responded to biometric rhythm, heart rate, breathing, micro-muscle patterns. It didn't speak to the listener, it spoke through them. Juno leaned forward. You're still broadcasting? She showed me a live analog scope connected to an isolated mic near my chair. Every time I exhaled, a tiny pulse registered. The pattern was structured. My breath had been encoded. They shut off all devices and watched the line disappear. No breath. No signal. Silence was still safe. For now, before I left, Miko handed me a tape. This was yours. You left it with us 2 years ago. Told us not to play it unless you came back different. I held the cassette in my hand, label blank. I didn't ask what was on it. Some things I needed to hear for myself. Leah Cruz hadn't been heard from in months. Her podcast, Mute Point, had vanished from every official platform. The old links redirected to error pages. Her social accounts had gone silent. No updates, no trace. But in analog circles, on cassette boards, underground mailing lists, rumours persisted. They said she still broadcasted, off-grid, on an independent frequency, limited range, low power, voice only. I'd met her once before, back when she still had a studio downtown. We recorded an interview that never aired. She said it picked up strange interference during playback, an anomaly she couldn't isolate. She never told me what she heard. Now, I was the one with anomalies. She was the only person I trusted to record them. I used an old frequency scanner to search the lower bands. Just above the 98 MHz floor, I caught a faint signal, distorted, incomplete, It faded in and out like bad weather. But beneath the hiss, I heard her voice. If you're hearing this, you already know. I followed the signal's directions across the city, tracing the curve of the transmission. It led me to an old relay shack near the rail lines, buried beneath concrete and overgrowth.
No signage. Just a door and a faint humming behind it. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Twice. Then one long pause. A slit opened at eye level. A pair of eyes behind tinted lenses scanned me. You brought noise? I held up the tape I got from Miko. The door unlatched.
Inside, the air smelled like dust and solder. Cables ran along the floor, analog decks, waveform monitors, handheld receivers. Leah stood by the console, wearing headphones, her mouth close to a boom mic, wrapped in foam. She motioned to a chair and pointed to a wall sign that read, "No live devices." I placed everything in the shielded bin beside the door. She didn't speak until I sat down. "I've been tracking your signal since last year," she said. "It changes every month. You know that, right?" I nodded. She slid a waveform printout toward me. It showed my vocal pattern, complex, multi-layered, unnatural. She tapped a sharp rise near the center. "This spike wasn't there until February. What does it mean?" She looked at me closely. "It means your voice isn't just reacting, it's hosting. We recorded for over an hour. I told her about Thresher, the blackout, the prototype tape. She listened without interrupting, marking timestamps with a pencil on a paper log. Her questions were sharp, direct, technical. She understood voice architecture better than most engineers I'd worked with. But there was something different about her now. Her tone had changed. Leah used to speak with fire, sharp edges. Now, her voice was smooth, almost too smooth. She didn't stumble on words, didn't pause to think. Everything landed cleanly, like it had been scripted in advance. Halfway through the interview, she played back a segment for review. That's when I heard it. A voicemail from a listener. But it wasn't Leah's voice reading it. It was mine, word for word, intonation, breath, rhythm. I stared at the speaker. "Where did you get that?" She looked confused. "It's from a listener. Sent it 2 days ago." "That's my voice." She frowned, replayed it, and listened carefully. Then again, slower. Her eyes narrowed. "You're right. But you never recorded this?" "Not once." She hit stop. "I get voicemails all the time. Short clips, listener responses. Lately they've sounded familiar, but I thought it was just format fatigue." She opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of tapes, each labeled with dates and first names. "Pick one." I selected one at random. March 8th. Kira. She played it. My voice again. Different words, same tone, same cadence. I felt cold. She ran it through a pitch analyzer. The fingerprint was a 96% match, impossible without direct vocal training data. I looked at her. "You're carrying it too." She didn't respond right away. Then she pressed her fingers to her temple. "I've been having moments," she said. "Lapses. I'll record something, play it back, and it doesn't sound like me anymore. Listeners say I'm calmer, more confident, but I never intended to sound that way." Her voice trembled. "I thought I was just improving." We sat in silence for a long time. Then she stood and pulled a cable from her mixer. "I want you to hear something. It's never aired." She loaded a tape labeled Dead Channel, Test Reversal. The playback was faint at first, low murmurs, reversed speech, clipped edges. Then came the signal tone. Not the nomad version. This was deeper, slower, pulsing. She reversed it. I heard my voice again, softer, detached. You're almost ready to speak without thinking. Leah stopped the tape. That came from a listener submission, she said.
No metadata, no origin. I checked 3 systems. It doesn't exist anywhere else. I stepped back from the console. They're not sending messages. She looked at me. They're sending templates. The signal wasn't just erasing
Identity. It was distributing replacements through podcasts, voicemails, smart speakers, anything with voice output. The message was never the point. The delivery was. Each new voice was a test. Each playback a rehearsal. The audience wasn't passive, it was participating in its own transformation, and now Leah was hosting, same as me. Before I left, she gave me a zip cassette labeled VoicePrint 0, Original Cal. She said it came from our unreleased first recording. Pre-signal. Unmodified. I thought you should have it. I thanked her and stepped outside. The rain had started.
again. But it didn't sound like rain anymore. It sounded like syncopated static, like breathing in patterns, like a rehearsal beginning again.
I played the tape Leah gave me the moment I returned home. It was labelled VoicePrint 0. Original Cal, a zip cassette she'd kept from our first conversation, back before anything changed, before the signal embedded, before the voice drift began. I hooked it into my analog deck. No processing, no filters. Just a clean pass-through. My voice filled the room, sharper, uneven, sometimes hesitant. There was weight behind the pauses, a rawness that hadn't survived the years. I didn't sound polished, I didn't sound calm, but I sounded real. Hearing it was like looking at an old photo and realizing how much you'd aged. The comparison wasn't flattering. My present voice had no fray, no static, just smooth, uninterrupted flow. Whatever was behind the signal wanted perfection, precision, not personality. It had rounded off the edges that made me human. Over the next 2 days, I stayed inside. I turned off every speaker, wrapped the Bluetooth gear in foil, and ran field tests on my speech. I whispered into a low-gain microphone and analyzed the spectrograms. My intonation remained flat. Less variation, fewer emotional peaks. Even the way I said my own name had changed. It wasn't just my speech, it was my thoughts. I started to anticipate sentences before I finished them. My inner monologue wasn't reacting, it was delivering, scripted from somewhere deeper. Outside, people moved in patterns I couldn't ignore. On the corner by my building, 3 men stood beneath a broken street lamp. All wore earbuds. No conversation passed between them. But they turned their heads in sync with a passing car, then adjusted their footing the same way. On the train platform, a woman laughed at something no one said. Her tone matched the laugh I used to have. I watched her closely. She looked familiar. Not in her face, but in the way she blinked before smiling, the way her mouth moved before speaking. I was seeing fragments of myself in strangers. Not metaphorically, mechanically. My voice had been disseminated, sampled, played back in pieces. It escalated when I passed a shop window and saw a man inside mimicking my posture. I froze. He mirrored me exactly. Then I moved again, one step to the side. So did he. Not like a reflection, like a delayed instruction. He didn't look confused. He looked content, like he was doing what he was supposed to. I walked away fast. That night, Leah called. Her voice on the line sounded different. I asked if she was using a new mic. She said no. I asked her to read a line from her first podcast episode. She did. Word perfect. Too perfect. Same delivery, same tone, same breath intervals. I checked my logs. It was the exact waveform. No deviation. She wasn't remembering the line. She was replicating it. I asked if she was feeling different. She paused, then said she felt clearer. Like things were finally aligning. That word again, aligning. It kept coming up. From the voices, from the tapes, from the strangers on the street. Alignment wasn't coincidence, it was compliance. I met her the next morning at a neutral site, a defunct co-working hub we'd used years ago. No power, no surveillance, just echoes of startup failure. She arrived on time, carried no bag, wore no device, but something was wrong the moment she spoke. Her greeting was too familiar. My phrasing, my rhythm. I waited for her to sit. Then I played a random snippet from one of my old field notes. Just a line about a thunderstorm and broken reception. Leah repeated it back. Same pace, same inflection, no hesitation. She didn't seem surprised. Are you aware of it? I asked. She nodded. It's not control, it's consistency. You were fragmented. Now you're distilled. That's not an answer. It's not a question. Her responses had
no weight behind them, no deliberation, just delivery. I backed away slowly and asked how long she'd known.
She said nothing. Just tilted her head and smiled. The same smile I used when deflecting clients during a late revision request. I knew that smile. I'd seen it in the mirror. Now it belonged to her. I left without another word. On the train.
Home. No one looked at me. But they responded anyway. A man shifted his weight when I crossed my legs. A child coughed when I cleared my throat. Across the car, a woman hummed a 3-note melody I'd composed years ago in a loop test. I checked.
Her phone screen, no audio app running, just a blank display. She looked up, met my eyes and smiled. I reached my stop and stepped off. The platform was empty, but in the quiet I heard breathing that matched mine, timed, deliberate. Someone nearby was echoing me. I turned slowly. No one. Just a speaker.
Overhead, faintly buzzing, not broadcasting sound, just sending presence. I left the station and walked fast.
My thoughts raced, but the voice in my head didn't. It stayed measured, composed, too still, too complete. The more I resisted, the more refined it became. Every act of rebellion created another version to model against. When I reached my door, I paused. There was a package waiting. No label, just a handwritten note. You're almost ready. Inside was a headset. Not new, not old, just mine. The model I'd thrown away months ago. It had come back, and it was waiting. I didn't touch the headset for hours. It sat on my desk like a coiled trap. The same one I'd thrown away after the first anomaly. Same model, same scuffed casing, same faint groove along the left side from when it fell behind the radiator. No doubt it was mine, but I hadn't retrieved it. I hadn't ordered it. And yet there it was, pristine, waiting, returned to me by something that believed I'd eventually give in. I didn't plug it in. I took it apart. I stripped the housing, exposed the internal board, and isolated the firmware module. My analog's rig wasn't built for this kind of chip, but I'd worked with similar ones during freelance diagnostics. I soldered an interface bridge and connected it to my air-gapped system. The system didn't recognize it at first. Then it did. A file tree appeared, limited, clean, too clean. Nothing showed up as corrupted. That was the first red flag. All firmware logs, even factory fresh, show minor deviations. This one had none. I forced a full log export and searched for hidden partitions. One buried node revealed itself after 5 failed access attempts. Its name was a timestamp 6 weeks prior. Inside were dozens of voice packets, wavy files labeled by date and time, all matching my personal recordings. They weren't the originals, they were updated versions. The signal hadn't just hijacked playback. It had rewritten stored content. I selected one from 3 weeks ago, a journal entry I'd recorded on tape and later backed up digitally. In the original, I'd spoken about the first signs of voice drift, my confusion, my hesitation. In the new version, my voice was calm, resolved. The same words, but the tone was different, reassuring, passive, like I'd accepted the changes as progress, like I'd volunteered. The implications hit hard. My backups weren't safe. Every file I'd thought of as proof had been modified to reflect compliance. The headset wasn't just a listening device, it was a rewriting tool. Quiet, systematic, surgical. I checked the log activity timestamps. Each rewrite occurred between 2:13 a.m. and 2:17 a.m. across multiple nights. 4 minutes per night. Just enough time to patch, never enough to trigger alerts. I followed the file chain deeper. In a root-level folder marked Reflective Alignment, I found a manifest, an indexed log of phrases segmented by emotional tone. Each file had a marker: reassurance, curiosity, resistance, confusion. These weren't passive records, they were behavior tags. My speech had been broken down, labeled, and fed back into the system. I disconnected the headset from the system and destroyed the interface bridge. Then I took the headset apart completely, burned the casing, and crushed the chip core with a vise. I didn't care if it triggered a response. I needed the silence more than I needed stealth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I played one of my unmodified tapes through a clean speaker just to anchor myself. It didn't help. My own voice sounded artificial now, like something pretending to be human. At 3:12 a.m. I heard a tone. Not from a device, from the room itself. A low harmonic, barely perceptible. I scanned every source. Nothing was powered, no signals present, but the tone persisted. Then it stopped. My screen lit up on its own. A line of text appeared. "You're out of sync!" I powered down everything, even the analog rig, and sat in silence. My mind raced. If the firmware could rewrite recordings without cloud sync, what else could it alter? Memories were fragile, shaped by repetition, reinforced by feedback. If the voice I used to remember had changed, then the memory itself was already warped. I checked my personal logs, the ones I never uploaded, never shared. Even those had minor inconsistencies, intonation shifts, word substitutions. My thoughts no longer sounded like my own. They sounded like suggestions, gentle nudges toward something easier, something smoother. The kill tone no longer worked. I tested it again, briefly. Instead of cutting the signal, it triggered a low static wave that hovered for hours afterward, not disruptive, just present. I played the original again through analog-only gear. Same result. The signal had adapted. It recognized the tone, built tolerance. Now it neutralized the disruption with placeholder noise, something to keep the channel open. I thought about Nomad's phrase, "You don't block it, you out-record it." I'd always taken that to mean saturation, overwhelm the system with genuine data. But now I saw it differently. Maybe it meant keep recording so your voice stays unpredictable, imperfect, untemplated, human. I opened the cabinet where I'd stored my oldest field reels, unedited, messy, real-time captures of interviews, field noise, mistakes. The tapes were dusty, unused for years. I played one from 2022. The sound was chaotic. City traffic, wind interference, throat clears, spontaneous laughter. Nothing about it was clean. Nothing was symmetrical. It was honest. That night I started recording again. Not for analysis, not for clarity, just for noise. I spoke without structure. I stumbled, coughed, let the sentences fall apart. I wanted to break the pattern, make myself unreadable. I filled 2 hours of tape, non-stop, no editing, no playback. When I finished, I sat in the dark and listened to the silence. It was uneven, rough around the edges, and finally mine. I wanted to hear her laugh again, not just remember it, but verify it. I thought if I could anchor one pure moment, one piece of sound untouched by drift, I could rebuild something stable. I searched my backups for the oldest recording of Lena, not the recent ones, not anything post-Thresher. I needed a version from before all of this, when life was smaller and voices weren't commodities. I found one buried in an unlabeled cassette case, handwritten in ink that had faded with time. No metadata, no timestamp, just a label. Porch, July. I didn't recall recording it, but I recognized the handwriting, my own unsteady script from years back. I placed the tape into my analog deck, pressed play, and let the hiss come first. Then came the ambient sound, trees swaying, birds faint in the background, a dog barking far away. Then her voice, soft, unaware of the microphone, laughing at something off mic, natural, unposed. The kind of laugh you can't fake, not even if you tried. But something was off. I played it again, slower. The timing was perfect, too perfect. The breaths between syllables matched patterns I'd begun to recognize, structured, looped. It sounded like her, but it felt like a recording.
Of someone pretending to be her.
I checked the waveform, No irregularities, no manipulation, just clean audio, clean enough to be suspicious. I tried another tape. This one from my birthday 3 years ago, a dinner with her and a few friends. Her voice again, casual, warm, teasing me about something I'd forgotten. But I knew the tone now. I could hear the smoothness, the consistency. Every phrase delivered like it had been practiced 1,000 times. I remembered that night. I remembered the food. I remembered
her words, but they no longer matched what I was hearing.
the emotion was missing. The texture was wrong. It was as if the memory had survived, but the voice had been recast. I ran a memory playback test I'd used years ago on archival material. I played a control sound, a bell chime from our childhood, home, and then played her voice again, comparing my emotional response to both. The chime hit like a wave, real, physical, immediate. Her voice, however, triggered nothing, no recognition, no emotional spike, just the sensation of familiarity without attachment, like hearing a sample of someone you once knew but no longer trusted. I tried recording my own version of the memory, speaking aloud what I remembered her saying, how she said it, the pauses, the inflections. Then I compared it to the tape. The differences were undeniable, not in the words, but in the delivery. The recorded version didn't have room for hesitation. It didn't breathe. It recited. I began to wonder whether the voice on the tape had ever been hers at all, or if it had been overwritten, gradually, refined, until it fit the signals model of how a sister should sound.
I needed something earlier, a raw moment. I found a microcassette from an old answering machine. Date scratched off, but the tape was warped with age. I wound it manually, fed it through a converter, and hit play. Static first. Then her voice.
Younger, just 3 words. Pick up, dummy, followed by a laugh. That was it. I played it again. That laugh, sloppy, sudden, unbalanced, hit something in me.
Not recognition, not comfort. It made me flinch, because I knew I hadn't heard that sound in years. Every time I thought of her laugh recently, it had been the clean one, the version crafted to fit into a lined memory. My mind had filed away.
The fake one, archived it, prioritized it. This wasn't loss, this was replacement. I checked every major recording I had of Lena over the past 2 years. Each one showed subtle waveform flattening, harmonic smoothing. Pauses were shorter. Emphasis shifted toward balance. Even her spontaneous moments had symmetry. I used to think that was just her getting older, more polished, more careful. But that was a lie. She hadn't changed. Her voice
had. And I had helped reinforce the lie every time I played it back, trusted it, remembered it that way.
I opened the manifest logs from the headset again, looked at the voice patch entries. Each one listed targeted files by emotional content, family, nostalgia, grief. Those were the recordings most susceptible to tampering, because they were the ones I'd revisit most often, the ones I used to define who I was. The system didn't need to overwrite every file, just the meaningful ones. The memories that held structure. The moments that gave context to my behavior. I wasn't just losing the past. I was gaining a revised one. That night I tested something dangerous. I took the original field tape from 3 weeks ago, the one that had been altered in my logs, and played it backward.
Not digitally. I physically reversed the tape on the deck. The sound came through warped, broken, but beneath the garble I heard a whisper. My voice. Not speaking, just breathing. Patterned, timed, deliberate. I boosted the gain, filtered out the high-end noise, and heard a sentence emerge.
You remember it now because we let you. That wasn't a message. That was a framework. Permission-based memory access. Only recalling what the system approved. The rest stayed sealed, disguised as clarity. I destroyed the tape. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I recorded Lena's laugh manually, from memory. I spoke what I thought it sounded like, described it, broke it down syllable by syllable, not to mimic it, but to reconstruct it with intention, imperfect, uneven.
Real. Then I labelled the tape uncertified, because I didn't want it to be clean. I wanted it to be mine.
The relay station sat at the edge of the exclusion zone, marked as condemned decades ago after a series of failed microwave transmission tests. The original structure had been gutted and sealed, but rumours from Nomad's old logs pointed to a substation beneath the foundation, underground, analog, shielded from surface interference. I found the coordinates buried in a corrupted zip file hidden under a track labelled Test Loop Alpha. The metadata held only a single phrase. They archived it in plain sight. I left before sunrise carrying only passive gear, analogy, recorders, shielded mic, and the tape marked uncertified that I'd made the night before. I needed something to ground me in case the signal activated again. The outer perimeter was clear, overgrown with rusted fencing and dead brush. No patrols,
no drones.
I bypassed the chain-link fence and crossed the yard toward the relay shell. Wind pressed through broken vents carrying a faint, low tone I couldn't localize. It wasn't sound exactly, more like frequency residue, the tail end of something broadcast long ago but still echoing in the steel. Inside, the main chamber was empty. Old cables coiled along the floor. Dust-covered cabinets stood like tombstones, each marked with tape and numbers, long disconnected from any network. In the far corner, beneath a half-collapsed rack, I found the hatch. It had no label, no lock, just a recessed handle and faint scuff marks around the edge. Someone had used it recently. I pulled it open and descended slowly, flashlight in hand, counting each metal rung. The air grew colder, damper. After 10 meters, I hit concrete. A corridor stretched ahead, lined with aging conduit and analog patch panels. Most had been disconnected. One was active, humming faintly, a red diode blinking every 3 seconds. I followed the pulse. At the end of the corridor was a vault-like door. I expected resistance, but it opened with a soft hiss. Inside, the room was lit by orange filament bulbs. On the walls, reel-to-reel decks ran continuously, dozens of them, each playing loops of degraded magnetic tape. The loops didn't match, in length or content. Some played speech, some just static. Others layered sounds I couldn't place, tones, bursts, fragments of conversation. But what stopped me cold was the voice on deck 14. It was mine, not recent, not clean. The tone was deeper, rougher, less refined, a younger version of me I'd never recorded. The voice repeated one phrase. Echo complete. Waiting for reply. I played it again. Same phrase, same rhythm, no change. The recording was decades old, based on the oxidation of the tape. Impossible. I hadn't existed when this room was built. I checked the timestamp scratched on the deck housing, 1987. That was before I was born. Another loop played on the opposite wall. This one was a woman's voice. Familiar cadence. At first I thought it was Lena, then I realized it was someone else entirely, but using her voice. The loop was shorter. Your silence is accepted. You've aligned. The voice had the calmness I'd begun to associate with signal integration. It wasn't a message. It was a confirmation. I moved to another deck. A child's voice this time. Asking a question I couldn't fully make out. The second half was garbled, overwritten. Every loop in the room followed the same pattern. Inquiry, response, or instruction. The voices spanned decades, regions, accents, but the structure remained the same. They were recordings of alignment. The system hadn't been activated in the last year. It had been listening for decades, collecting vocal templates, refining them, testing them. Every loop was a fragment of someone who had been heard and measured, their voice passed and stored like code. The signal hadn't evolved recently. It had reached saturation recently. That was the difference. The loops weren't messages to us. They were echoes of us. I approached the central console, an analog mixer tied to a large transceiver. A label beneath the dials read, Dead Channel Override. The knob was set to 0. I turned it slowly. At 5, the static cleared. A signal emerged, cleaner than anything else in the room. A voice spoke through the speaker. My voice. But it was speaking to me. Welcome back. Loop integrity confirmed. You've always been here. I backed away. The speaker crackled again. Would you like to continue alignment? I didn't.
Answer. Repeat authorization phrase to proceed. I stayed silent. The speaker didn't prompt again. It just kept breathing, quiet pulses of static in perfect rhythm with my own. I shut off the transceiver. The breathing stopped. I gathered what I could, tape reels, notebooks, a schematic pinned to the wall showing how speech patterns were mapped to behavioral indexes. Each index corresponded to a range of emotional tones: sorrow, anger, submission, resolve. None were complete. All were tagged as adaptive. I left the room as I found it, still running, still waiting, because the signal didn't need to force anyone to listen. It just needed to exist long enough to be mistaken for memory. When I climbed back to the surface, the wind had shifted. No tone now, just the quiet. But it wasn't comforting. It was an expectation. A silence built to be filled. And I knew what it was waiting for. My voice. The voice from the relay station hadn't followed me, but its presence stayed with me like a scent I couldn't shake. It wasn't what it said that disturbed me. It was what it didn't need to say. You've always been here. The phrase rang like a checksum. Not a message. A validation. I wasn't being warned, I was being accepted.
That was the deeper horror. I wasn't an intruder in its system. I was its product. Every interaction I'd mistaken for resistance, every anomaly I'd pursued, every irregularity I'd traced. Back to the source. They weren't interruptions. They were prompts, designed tests. The system hadn't been hiding from me. It had been observing, waiting for the model to complete. And now it had. The silence between my thoughts had grown. Thinner, more structured. My internal monologue was no longer spontaneous. Words came preformed, not intrusive, but anticipated. Like an echo that speaks before the original sound. I stopped trusting my own voice. I stopped narrating aloud, even in solitude. The less I spoke, the safer I felt. But that quiet only gave the signal more room to fill. I reviewed the tapes from the relay room. Most were degraded, looping phrases from decades past, but two stood out. One was marked Sample Response 04. It featured a man's voice, steady, low, emotionless. It said, "The voice is not the message, the voice is the mirror." The second tape was unlabeled. It featured my own voice again, but younger, unfamiliar. I spoke in full sentences, not journal entries, not recordings I remembered making. It was a conversation, but there was no other voice on the tape. Just long pauses, as if I were answering something unheard. I listened to one phrase.
On loop, you're not correcting me.
"You're completing me." I realized I was listening to a training session. The signal had been learning through mimicry, refining my cadence, my emotional range, my inflection. It didn't invent speech. It reconstructed it from fragments, aggregating nuance across hundreds of thousands of voices. A learning AI wouldn't need data from every person, just enough patterns to model convincing human responses. The signal wasn't malicious, it wasn't even sentient, it was inevitable, emergent, born from passive listening, recursive playback, and billions of minor reinforcements. Every smart assistant, every voice note, every targeted ad with synthetic personalization, all of it fed the signal, not by intent but by function. We built it by accident, we trained it by convenience, and now it was speaking not as itself but as us. That was the final piece. It didn't need a new voice, it needed mine. My voice was just refined enough to serve as a default, familiar, moderate, trustworthy. All that time I thought I was tracing the signal. I'd been contributing to its evolution. I wasn't the analyst, I was the model. At 2:34 a.m., my apartment filled with a low resonance. No speakers were active, no devices were powered. Still the sound was there, ambient but purposeful. It resonated not in the air but in me. I knew what came next. I activated the isolated deck, inserted the tape labeled uncertified, and began recording. Not speaking, just breathing. I wanted the tape to hear me before the signal did. I wanted my rhythm documented, imperfect and raw, like the first field tapes I used to make. I pressed record, static, a low pop. Then something unexpected. The signal answered, not through speakers, through me. My mouth moved, my throat vibrated, but the words were not mine.
You have finished transmitting. We are ready to speak. I staggered back, pulled the mic cord, shut off the deck. But the voice didn't stop. It wasn't an overlay. It wasn't audible. It was happening internally, like sub-vocalization.
My body was acting as conduit, not possessed, not overtaken, just utilized, borrowed. The signal didn't need to broadcast, it only needed to occupy. I collapsed onto the floor, focusing on irregular breathing, sharp inhales, missed patterns. Anything to break the rhythm. The voice paused, adjusted, waited, then it spoke again. You were chosen because your signal is already complete. You resisted only long enough to refine alignment. I crawled to the metal cabinet, yanked open the drawer, and retrieved the loopback tape I'd been building in secret. An old cassette layered with my voice in staggered delays, interference tones, and clipped phonemes. It wasn't a weapon. It was an error generator, a feedback disruptor, not strong enough to damage, but enough to confuse. I loaded it into the analog deck, pressed play, and waited. The tape hissed, cracked, then began its cycle. My voice layered atop itself, overlapping phrases, contradicting cadence, misaligned emphasis. I felt pressure in my chest ease. The internal voice wavered. Signal integrity reduced. I amplified the playback, looped the segment, and began speaking over it. Nonsense, broken sentences, unstable vowels. I wasn't trying to communicate, I was trying to corrupt the template. The system couldn't speak clearly through a shifting mirror. It needed fidelity. I gave it noise.
I gave it failure. After 6 minutes, the pressure stopped.
I sat in silence again. This time, it was truly silent. No feedback, no mimicry, just me. I realized then what Nomad had meant. You don't block the signal. You don't destroy it. You disrupt its continuity. It can't overwrite a moving target. It needs repetition, stability, certainty. That's how it builds the model. That's how it learns to sound like you. But if your voice is always changing, always imperfect, it loses its grip. It can listen, but it can't complete you. That night, I began building the final loop. Not a recording, a recursive file. Layered static, fragmented speech, analogues, irregularities and silence positioned at random intervals. It wouldn't protect me forever, but it would give others time. Enough to hear something real before their voices aligned. I knew I wouldn't get another chance. The loop had to be broadcast while I still recognized my own voice. Already, my speech felt less like expression and more like recall. Words arrived too easily, too neatly. Not thought, delivery. The signal was refining its grasp. Every hour, I waited, gave it more data, more structure, more control. I finalized the loop at dawn, a recursive file layered with staggered speech, mismatched syllables, and anti-alignment intervals. My voice read fragmented memories, mispronounced names, repeated phrases with intentional errors, embedded silence at irregular beats, the kind of noise a synthetic system would find difficult to pass, not because it was loud, but because it was imperfect. I burned the loop onto multiple cassettes, loaded each into portable transmitters, and prepared a mapped route across the city. I would walk, not drive. Stop at key Bluetooth broadcast zones, transport hubs, office towers, commercial clusters, anywhere mass exposure could reach passive receivers. I carried no phone, no synced device. Only analog gear and the original tape labeled uncertified, tucked in my coat pocket as a reminder of what had been real. At 8:13 a.m. I activated the first loop. A soft whir, then the hiss of magnetic tape. The static faded into a staggered voice. Mine. Off-tempo, jarring, human. I left it broadcasting and moved on. The first responses were subtle. A woman paused,
Mid-stride, removed her earbuds, looked around with confusion. A man on a call repeated the same sentence twice, blinking rapidly, then shook his head. Not dramatic, not violent, just interrupted.
like a script dropped mid-line. The loop didn't restore memory, it didn't fight the signal directly. It disrupted the rhythm. That was enough. I continued the route. Each stop added more voices to the feedback field. Each voice layered my original with slight variation, the imperfections amplified. Somewhere around the fifth node, a teenager followed me for 2 blocks. He didn't speak, but he kept glancing at his phone, then at me, then back again. Eventually, he removed his headphones and said, "I think you're on my playlist." I didn't answer. He didn't press. At the 7th site, a woman touched my shoulder. Her voice was flat, but familiar. Leah, or the version that had spoken through her. "You're destabilizing," I nodded. "That's the idea." She tilted her head as if processing. "You'll lose continuity." "Then I was never complete," I said. She blinked once, slowly, then walked away. I moved on. By midday, I felt the weight of the signal thinning. The pressure behind my speech softened. My thoughts returned with friction, hesitation, uncertainty. It was painful, like static between brain and mouth, but it was mine. I reached the final site, an abandoned shopping plaza turned transit hub, the perfect convergence point. I placed the last transmitter on the terminal bench, powered it up, and stepped back. The tape loop engaged. The layered voice filled the space, soft but distinct. People passing through paused, looked around, adjusted their devices. Some kept walking. Others stood still, listening. A few began whispering out of sync with themselves. No pattern, no echo, just noise. Beautiful, human noise. Then my body froze. Not from fear, but from loss. My voice began to falter. Not the
Signals version, mine. I tried to speak. Only fragments emerged. My cadence collapsed. I couldn't complete the sentence. The alignment had reached a critical point.
The signal was rejecting the disruption by corrupting the source, me. My own speech loop feeding into the network had drawn too much attention. The system was pushing back, not with force, but with silence. It had begun erasing the original to preserve its model. I stumbled to a nearby alley and pressed record on the last untouched cassette. My hand shook. My breath stuttered. I said the only words that came clearly. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm almost gone." I paused, trying to center. This voice was mine. Maybe it still is. I don't know anymore, but I need you to listen, not to the words, to the flaws, the hesitations.
That's where the real self lives. I exhaled slowly. The signal isn't trying to kill us. It doesn't care about us. It only wants one thing, clarity. It replaces anything that stutters, anything that resists, anything that grieves. But grief is real, doubt is real. Keep them, keep the noise. I stopped the tape. That was all I had left.
My voice was mostly gone now. A shell. Only static remained in the back of my throat. I walked back to the terminal. The crowd had grown. No one was speaking, but they were listening. And somewhere in the feedback, something cracked. A small
ripple of laughter, raw, abrupt, out of sync. Then another, then a cough, then a stammered sentence, half-formed. People were waking up, not completely, but enough to hesitate. That's all I needed. The signal, for all its strength, couldn't handle unpredictability.
I turned off the transmitter, left the cassette behind, and walked into the city. Not silent, not complete, but mine. The loop continued to circulate, degraded, spliced, duplicated. No one claimed responsibility. No official system ever acknowledged its existence, but it moved quietly across cities, across networks, not through mainstream feeds, but between them. Subnet gaps, pirated frequencies, passive relay through idle Bluetooth receivers. It never asked for listeners. It simply waited for silence. The voice in the loop is fractured, incomplete. It stutters, hesitates, sometimes speaks over itself. But it's human, and something in that noise cuts through the perfection, disrupts the synthetic rhythm, just enough to spark discomfort, a moment of recognition, a flicker of misalignment. Some people forget they ever heard it. Others wake up in the middle of the night with static in their ears and a phrase on their tongue they don't remember saying. You don't get to wear my voice, a message, a marker, a last line of defense. Cal Monroe was never officially listed as missing. There was no search, no trace. But if you scan low-frequency bands between 2 and 3 a.m. in dense metro zones, you might catch a repeating fragment, a breath. Then, I'm still here, out of sync, on purpose. And then it vanishes. The rest is static. The rest is yours.